Hi, welcome to this presentation. My name is Dino Sossi. It is titled You Can Run, But You Can't Hide the Impact of Surveillance Technologies in Schools. I'm going to give you a quick overview of the presentation. It's 5 parts. First, I'm going to talk about Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon model and how it's effective for prisons. Then Michel Foucault's Panopticon analysis across institutions. Third, George Orwell's governmental surveillance of citizens. Fourth, Walter Kern's inversion of government surveillance to self-surveillance. And finally, 5, surveillance implications for education. So hopefully through 1 through 4, I can set up number 5. First, Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon model and its use for effective prisons. So this presentation goes way back in terms of its origins. I'm sure some of you have heard the term Panopticon. For those of you who haven't, it's basically there's 2 kind of major definitions. One, it deals with an institutional building, which I'll get to in a second. It's also more broadly a system of control. It was created by English philosopher and social theorist Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century. If you break down the parts of the word itself, Panopticon, pan meaning all, opticon meaning can be observed. And again, for the purposes of its origins, the pan, the all, was inmates of an institution. Before, there were roots of the word panopticon. It's from panoptes. It's from a Greek mythology. It was a giant with 1,000 eyes, and it was a single watchman who would be able to sleep, but because he has so many eyes, he could have other eyes open. So it was sort of to feed this myth of the ever-watching watchman. And what is a panopticon in terms of prisons? When you have a panopticon, the inmates within a prison, they cannot tell if they're being watched. So when you have a watchman or even a couple of watchmen, they can't observe all the cells at once. So you use the structure of the panopticon to be able to allow them to be perceived as seeing all cells at once. And because of this, inmates act like they're always being watched because of the way it's constructed. And again, I'll show you that in a second. It compels the inmates to constantly control their behavior. So you see on the diagram on the left, there's an N in the middle. Basically, that's where the tower would be, where the watchman would be, and around the periphery and the lower part of the structure on the left, or the image on the left. That's where all the individual cells are. If you look at the right, that kind of gives you more of how it would look if you were within them. So you see this as this inmate, he or she is on their knees, and then the watchtower where the watchman is centered is in the distance. So this is an actual view of a prison design in this way, where you see in the middle, it's where the watchman would be in the middle, and then around the periphery are all the different cells. And this is in Illinois. For those of you who are into pop culture, here's an example of a panopticon. In one of the Batman's movies, Morgan Freeman plays Lucius Fox, who works with Batman, and through sonar, he can see across the city. And so these are all camera feeds from the sonar. Part 2 deals with Michel Foucault's Panopticon analysis across institutions. So I'm going to be broadening out from just being about prisons right now. Here's a quote from Foucault's Discipline and Punishment. The panopticon must not be understood as a dream building. It is the diagram of a mechanism of power reduced to its ideal form. And the power in this sense is the central watch person exercising power over everyone in the periphery. Here's a quote, a longer quote. At the center, this tower is pierced with wide windows that open onto the inner side of the ring. The peripheral building is divided into cells. All that is needed then is to place a supervisor in central tower to shut up in each cell a madman, a patient, a condemned man, a worker, a schoolboy. So again, this broadens out the definition of panopticon from Bentham to show a panopticon having many more people that could potentially be surveilled than just a prisoner. Here again, from that quote, I'm going to spell it out a little bit more specifically. But there are various situations and subjects of surveillance. For example, in a sanatorium, that would surveil a madman, a hospital would surveil a patient, a prison would surveil a condemned man, a workplace would surveil a worker, and a learning institution would be a schoolboy or a schoolgirl. And then the Panopticon, its impact is that it's a tool for surveilling prisoners has been reconceptualized even more broadly and pervasively across society. So again, it's not just for a prisoner, it can be for a madman, a patient, a worker, a schoolboy, or a schoolgirl. Now I'm going to talk about George Orwell's government surveillance of citizens. I'm sure many of you have heard of or probably read Big Brother, or Orwell's 1984, which it introduces the character Big Brother. It's from Orwell's 1949 novel, 1984. A lot of numbers there. Big Brother is a totalitarian leader of the book's fictional state. He leads an overly intrusive and controlling government. Within the novel, people are watched and controlled constantly by Big Brother, and we are reminded frequently that Big Brother is watching you. Here's a picture of this Hitler-looking fellow who's depicted as Big Brother. That, again, I'm not going to go into the Big Brother part, the Orwell part, because I'm sure all of you have heard of it, at least heard of it in passing, if again, if you haven't just actually read the book. But now I'm going to talk about something I think a bit more interesting is Walter Kern's inversion of government surveillance to self-surveillance. Kern wrote an article about Little Brother. So, and he wrote this in the aftermath of Tyler Clementi, who was the Rutgers freshman who was surveilled by his roommate, and Clementi was freshly out of the closet, a young gay man who was liaising with another gay gentleman, and after being surveilled and his roommate watching him through Clementi's own computer, Clementi found out, and eventually he jumped up to the George Washington Bridge and killed himself. So Kern wrote this idea of Little Brother in response to that tragedy. Quote, "It isn't some stern and monolithic Big Brother that we have to reckon with as we go about our daily lives. It's a vast cohort of prankish little brothers." In this case, it was Clementi's roommate, but I think he's talked more broadly about how we're surveilled by our friends, family, and peers. From this, what percentage of internet users say they worry about how much information is available about them online? This is in 2010. You might want to make a guess. It's 33%, which now is probably the conservative estimate, given that's like quite a while ago. Here's another quote. "The invasion of privacy, of others' privacy, but also our own, as we turn our lenses on ourselves in the quest for attention by any means, has been democratized." And I'd leave you this question from this. Are you worried more about your privacy being invaded by the government, by corporations, or your peers? And I think some of the factors you want to think about is if, for number one, the government, if you lived in more of an authoritarian as opposed to a democratic society, you might be more worried about governments. I think most people today living in a late capitalist global society, corporations have so much of our data that you might justifiably be worried about corporations invading your privacy. And then maybe depending on your age and maybe your social sphere, you may be more worried about your peers, your friends, your family, your coworkers, about them invading your privacy. So again, there's no really right or wrong answer here. I think it just all depends on context. And finally, I'm going to talk briefly about surveillance implications for education. We are monitored constantly in a surveillance society. There's almost no other way to get around that. Like, we are just being constantly surveilled wherever we go these days. Especially as long as we have a smartphone, laptop, desktop, or we're walking around in a major city where there's cameras everywhere. Schools are increasingly places where students are watched by security officers, CCTV cameras, people using the computers or maybe a smart device, and even simply something as old school as staff patrolling schools for student malfeasance. From all of this, we should think about the extent surveillance technology impacts learning environments and social control they exert. Once you sort of realize that you are being constantly surveilled, it has to have an impact on people who know that. And finally, from this, here's some questions I want to leave you with, and maybe you can think about them in a discussion or as you go out on your own. Are schools civil panopticons? Are they basically like Foucault said, a teacher surveils their students? If so, do they spread education? If so, how? Is CCTV video a benevolent panoptic tool? How about computers, smartphones? What about school security officers? Do they have benevolent or malign impacts on the people that are surveilled? And then by conducting constant surveillance on students, are we promoting inter-surveillance between them, such as in the case of Clementi? Again, once people know that they're being surveilled, wouldn't it make sense that they might be enacting those types of behaviors on their friends, their family, etc.? So that was You Can Run, But You Can't Hide: The Impact of Surveillance Technology in Schools. Thanks for watching.